The Doomsday Clock now stands at just 85 seconds to midnight. That is the closest humanity has ever been since the clock was first created in 1947. Symbolically, it means we are nearer to self-annihilation than at any point during the Cold War or in modern history. Scientists stress that this decision is not emotional or political. It reflects a deadly combination of active wars, escalating nuclear risk, the collapse of long-standing arms control agreements, and the rapid integration of artificial intelligence into military systems without adequate oversight or safeguards. In other words, this is no longer about one isolated conflict. This is a system losing its brakes. As one war drags on, another confrontation ignites. When diplomacy stalls, force takes its place, and when leaders prioritize power over human life, the consequences are global. In other words, this is no longer about one isolated conflict. This is a system losing its brakes. As one war drags on, another confrontation ignites. When diplomacy stalls, force takes its place. And when leaders prioritize power over human life, the consequences are global. What is most alarming is that we are witnessing a failure of leadership on a worldwide scale, not in one country and not in one region. From reckless military decisions to the dismissal of scientific warnings, every signal points to a new and dangerous era where mistakes can no longer be undone. And to understand why scientists issued such an urgent warning, we have to confront what is happening right now. It begins in Europe, where an attack on civilians has shocked the world and exposed the dark reality of power deals being negotiated behind the cover of violence and war. What is happening in Ukraine right now shows exactly why these warnings can no longer be ignored. This is not an abstract geopolitical debate. This is about civilians being killed while global powers negotiate behind closed doors. Ukrainian prosecutors confirmed that a Russian drone strike hit a civilian passenger train in northeastern Ukraine, killing at least 5 people. According to officials, the train was traveling near a small village when it was struck. There were no military targets in the area. There was no strategic justification. This was a train carrying ordinary people. Images from the scene show burned-out rail cars sitting beside snow-covered tracks. Prosecutors say that one drone struck the train directly while 2 others hit nearby areas. At the time of the attack, the train was carrying between 150 and 200 passengers. 18 people were inside the car that took the direct hit. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned the attack as brutal and deliberate. He stated clearly that there could be no military purpose behind such an action and that targeting civilians is a war crime, plain and simple. Investigators at the scene reported finding remains of the victims scattered near the wreckage, underscoring the human cost of this strike. But as horrifying as the attack itself is, what is unfolding behind the scenes is just as disturbing. According to multiple diplomatic sources, the United States has privately signaled to Ukraine that American security guarantees will depend on Ukraine agreeing to a peace deal with Russia. In other words, continued protection and long-term security support may come with conditions attached. For Ukraine, this is not a technical detail. American security guarantees are seen as essential to ending the war on terms that do not reward aggression. Without them, any peace agreement risks becoming a pause rather than a solution. Just days ago, the United States served as a mediator in talks held in Abu Dhabi between Ukrainian and Russian representatives. American officials said the discussions produced some progress and expressed optimism that a deal could be within reach. However, reporting from Financial Times suggests that the Trump administration has made it clear that U.S. security guarantees would be contingent on Ukraine accepting a negotiated settlement. That settlement could include painful concessions, potentially involving territory in the Donbass region. Sources familiar with the talks have pushed back against claims that Washington is directly forcing Ukraine to give up land. They insist that the United States is not dictating the terms of any agreement. But from Kiev's perspective, the pressure is unmistakable. President Zelensky has repeatedly stated that Ukraine's territorial integrity must be fully guaranteed in any peace deal. He has emphasized that surrendering territory would undermine both Ukraine's sovereignty and the international rules meant to prevent wars of conquest. Yet Ukrainian officials are increasingly skeptical. One senior Ukrainian source told reporters that every time discussions reach the point where security guarantees could be finalized, the United States hesitates. Promises stall, commitments soften, and uncertainty grows. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has made its position clear. Russian officials continue to insist that territorial issues remain central to any agreement to end the fighting. That stance places Ukraine in an impossible position. Accept a deal that could legitimize territorial seizure or risk standing alone against a larger aggressor. This is the reality facing Ukraine right now. Civilians are dying in attacks that shock the conscience, while diplomats debate frameworks and conditions far from the battlefield. The contrast could not be more stark, and this is why the story of that train matters so much. It is not just a tragic headline. It is a reminder of what is at stake when power politics override accountability. When negotiations proceed without justice, civilians pay the price. What comes next will shape not only Ukraine's future, but the credibility of the global system that claims to protect innocent lives. And as the war grinds on, the gap between stated values and real-world decisions is becoming impossible to ignore. What is unfolding in the Middle East right now is pushing the world even closer to the brink, and once again, Donald Trump is at the center of it. As tensions with Iran escalate, the United States has moved additional military assets into the region. A U.S. aircraft carrier strike group, along with escort warships, has entered Middle Eastern waters, dramatically expanding American military capacity near Iran. The message is unmistakable. Washington is signaling that force remains firmly on the table. At the same time, regional allies are scrambling to distance themselves from the growing risk of war. Saudi Arabia has issued a clear warning that it will not allow its airspace or territory to be used for any military action against Iran. In a direct message to Iranian leadership, Saudi officials emphasized that the kingdom supports dialogue and de-escalation, not another catastrophic conflict. The United Arab Emirates quickly echoed that position. Abu Dhabi stated it would not permit its airspace or waters to be used in any strike against Iran. These statements revealed just how volatile the situation has become. Even close U.S. partners are trying to erect firewalls to avoid being pulled into a regional war. Yet Donald Trump is moving in the opposite direction. Speaking to reporters, Trump claimed that the United States had already eliminated Iran's nuclear capabilities in a previous operation. He described the action as necessary and justified, insisting that Iran was only weeks away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. He then added something that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Trump announced that another powerful U.S. fleet was now moving toward Iran. He described it as beautiful and formidable, a choice of words that underscored the troubling way he frames military escalation. This was not the language of caution. It was the language of intimidation. Trump said he hoped Iran would agree to a deal with Washington, adding that they should have made a deal the first time. But this was diplomacy backed by threat, a deal or else. This is the moment where everything sharpens, because if you want to understand how quickly global events are moving and how dangerous this escalation truly is, this is exactly why you need to stay informed in real time. If you want breaking updates, clear analysis, and coverage that cuts through the spin, now is the moment to subscribe to TN News 24. Subscribing ensures you get immediate access to urgent developments as they happen, especially when the stakes are this high. Back to the situation on the ground. While Trump talks about deals and fleets, Iran remains deeply unstable. The country has recently experienced widespread protests. Human rights organizations report that security forces have killed thousands, including civilians and foreign nationals. These groups describe the crackdown as the most severe since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Iranian officials deny responsibility, blaming unrest on foreign-backed agitators, and accusing the United States and Israel of interference. But the internal pressure facing Iran only adds another layer of unpredictability to an already volatile standoff. Meanwhile, the European Union is preparing a new round of sanctions targeting Iran. Officials say the measures will focus on individuals and organizations connected to drone and missile production. These sanctions are expected to bring EU policy closer to the hardline approach already taken against Russia. However, one issue continues to divide European leaders: whether to designate Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. Some EU members argue that the group's role in repression and regional destabilization makes such a designation necessary. Others warn that doing so could permanently sever diplomatic channels with Tehran. This debate highlights the broader crisis at hand. Military threats are increasing. Diplomatic tools are weakening. Trust between global powers is eroding. And once again, the pattern is familiar. Escalation replaces restraint. Power replaces accountability, and civilians across the region bear the risk of decisions made far from their homes. As U.S. warships move closer and rhetoric grows sharper, the margin for error shrinks. One miscalculation, one misunderstanding, one decision made for political optics rather than human cost. And suddenly, the countdown that scientists warned about no longer feels symbolic at all. As tensions rise in the Middle East, Europe is now facing its own reckoning, not just about Iran, but about where moral responsibility ends and political convenience begins. The European Union is preparing a new package of sanctions targeting roughly 20 Iranian individuals and organizations. These measures are expected to focus on restricting exports of components that Iran could use to manufacture drones and missiles. Officials say the goal is to limit Tehran's military capabilities and its ability to support allied conflicts abroad. But beneath that consensus lies a deep and unresolved divide. At the center of the debate is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This powerful force was created after Iran's 1979 revolution and plays a central role in the country's military, economy, and internal security apparatus. It oversees Iran's ballistic missile program and has been repeatedly linked to violent crackdowns on protesters. Several EU member states have pushed to formally designate the Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. They argue that the group's actions meet every legal and moral threshold for such a classification: mass repression, political violence, regional destabilization. Others are far more cautious. France, in particular, has warned that such a move could completely sever remaining diplomatic channels with Tehran. French officials have made clear that maintaining limited lines of communication is seen as essential, especially when European citizens are involved. Paris is also concerned that a hardline designation could complicate sensitive efforts to secure the release and safe return of French nationals previously detained in Iran. This disagreement exposes a fundamental tension inside the European Union. How do democratic governments respond to authoritarian repression without closing the door to diplomacy? At what point does caution become complicity? Italy recently signaled a shift, with its foreign minister stating support for designating the Guard Corps as a terrorist group. That move has increased pressure on France, now the largest EU member openly opposing the designation. Behind closed doors, European diplomats admit the debate has intensified due to ongoing unrest in Iran and the violent response by security forces. Public pressure is growing. Silence is becoming harder to justify. This is not just a policy disagreement. It is a test of credibility. When governments speak about human rights, accountability, and the rule of law, their actions matter. And when those actions hesitate in the face of political risk, the message is not lost on the people watching from the streets of Tehran or the cells of political prisons. Europe now stands at a crossroads. One path preserves leverage and dialogue. The other draws a clear moral line. What it chooses will shape not only its relationship with Iran, but its standing in a world where values are increasingly tested by power. As global tensions mount, Donald Trump is not narrowing his focus. He is expanding it. From the Middle East to the Western Hemisphere, Trump is opening new fronts and applying pressure far beyond any single conflict zone. In one of his most explicit warnings yet, Trump publicly cautioned Iraq against selecting Nouri al-Maliki as prime minister. He made it clear that if Iraq chose Maliki, the United States would reconsider its support. According to Trump, Iraq under Maliki's previous leadership descended into poverty, chaos, and violence, and he argued that a return to that era would be unacceptable. This was not a subtle diplomatic message. It was a threat. Choose differently or lose American backing. For Iraq, a country long caught between Washington and Tehran, the warning underscored how fragile its political balance has become. Trump's statement came just days after political blocs aligned with Iran moved to elevate Maliki once again. At the same time, U.S. officials have reportedly discussed potential sanctions if Iran-backed armed groups are brought into Iraq's next government. The message was unmistakable. Alignment comes with consequences. Trump then turned his attention to Cuba. Speaking to reporters, he predicted that the Cuban government would soon collapse. According to Trump, Cuba had relied heavily on oil and financial support from Venezuela, support that has now largely disappeared. He pledged to block any remaining flow of resources, framing the move as a necessary step to hasten change on the island. Trump described Cuba as being on the brink. No money, no oil, no lifeline. Cuban leaders responded sharply, rejecting the notion that Washington had any moral authority to dictate terms or demand concessions. They accused the United States of economic warfare and interference, arguing that pressure would only deepen suffering rather than produce reform. But Trump was not finished. Venezuela soon followed. After the arrest of the country's former leader, the United States installed an interim government, hoping to steer Caracas away from alliances with Iran, China, and Russia. American officials have made it clear that cooperation is expected. That includes expelling foreign diplomats and advisors aligned with U.S. rivals. Yet intelligence assessments suggest uncertainty. Washington is not convinced that Venezuela's interim leadership is fully aligned with U.S. strategy. Behind the scenes, CIA officials have traveled to Caracas to assess the situation and discuss Venezuela's political future. The stakes are enormous. Venezuela holds some of the largest oil reserves in the world. U.S. officials see economic opportunity if the country shifts course. But if control slips, pressure could escalate further. Trump has hinted at continued maximum pressure, warning that failure to cooperate could lead to deeper intervention. At the same time, opposition figures with strong public support are being quietly evaluated as potential long-term alternatives. Taken together, Iraq, Cuba, and Venezuela reveal a broader pattern. This is not isolated decision-making. It is a strategy built on coercion, leverage, and conditional support. The question is not whether pressure works in the short term. The question is what kind of instability it creates in the long term. Because when power replaces partnership, the consequences rarely stay contained. While pressure expands across Europe, the Middle East, and the Western Hemisphere, Asia is now emerging as one of the most dangerous fronts in the global nuclear equation. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has announced that the ruling Workers' Party will soon unveil new plans aimed at further strengthening the country's nuclear war deterrence. According to state media, Kim personally oversaw the successful test of a large-caliber multiple-launch rocket system, praising the weapon for its improved accuracy, mobility, and striking power. Kim described the test as a clear warning. He stated that building reliable offensive capabilities and an effective deterrent force remains a central policy of the North Korean state. Any attempt at military confrontation, he said, would be met with overwhelming force. South Korea and Japan immediately condemned the launch, reporting that North Korea had fired what appeared to be short-range ballistic missiles into surrounding waters. Pyongyang has long ignored United Nations bans on ballistic missile development, and each test further erodes already fragile regional stability. But the danger does not stop with one country. North Korea's actions are part of a much larger pattern. Across Asia, military posturing is intensifying. Nuclear-armed states are modernizing their arsenals. Diplomatic channels are narrowing, and the systems designed to prevent miscalculation are weakening. This is one of the core reasons scientists recently moved the Doomsday Clock closer to midnight. According to nuclear policy experts, the risk today is not only intentional war, but accidental escalation. As communication breaks down and military systems become faster and more automated, the window for human judgment is shrinking. Artificial intelligence now plays an increasing role in surveillance, targeting, and decision support. Yet oversight remains dangerously limited. Experts warn that integrating AI into nuclear command structures introduces new vulnerabilities, including misinterpretation of data, false alarms, and rapid escalation without adequate human review. At the same time, long-standing arms control agreements are unraveling. The New START Treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, is set to expire soon. That treaty limits the number of deployed nuclear warheads on each side. Without it, there will be no binding framework restraining the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. Adding to the concern, recent statements from U.S. leadership have revived discussion of restarting nuclear weapons testing, something that has not occurred among major nuclear powers for decades. Experts caution that renewed testing could trigger a chain reaction, pushing other nations to follow suit and accelerating a global arms race. Scientists stress that no country would benefit more from such a breakdown than those currently expanding their nuclear stockpiles. Once testing resumes, the norm against nuclear escalation collapses. This environment creates a perfect storm: multiple active conflicts, rising nationalism, technological acceleration, and the collapse of trust between major powers. Alexandra Bell, a nuclear policy expert involved in monitoring the Doomsday Clock, described the current moment as a failure of global leadership. She warned that when governments embrace zero-sum competition and abandon cooperation, risk multiplies rapidly. In her assessment, the world is witnessing several military campaigns unfolding under the shadow of nuclear weapons. Each one increases the chance of miscalculation. Each one shortens the distance to catastrophe. This is why the Doomsday Clock matters. It is not a metaphor designed to scare. It is a signal, a warning that the systems meant to protect humanity are breaking down at the same time that destructive power is increasing. And unless this trajectory changes, the question is no longer whether a crisis will occur, but when. As the world grapples with rising conflict abroad, the United States is facing its own growing instability at home, and the cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. In recent days, tensions have surged following the fatal shooting of American civilians by federal law enforcement officers, including personnel connected to immigration enforcement. The incident sparked widespread outrage and protests, particularly in Minnesota, where video footage showed one victim holding only a phone and posing no visible threat at the time he was killed. President Trump responded by saying his administration would attempt to reduce tensions slightly, even as he defended federal authorities and dismissed broader calls for accountability. His comments drew criticism across the political spectrum, including from gun rights advocates who noted that the victim had been legally permitted to carry a firearm under state law. At the same time, relations between the federal government and local leaders in several states have grown increasingly strained. Human rights groups warn that aggressive enforcement tactics are fueling unrest rather than restoring order, and protests against immigration authorities continue to spread. And then there is the climate crisis unfolding in real time. A brutal winter storm has swept across much of the United States, killing at least 38 people across 14 states. Millions remain under extreme cold warnings. Hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses have lost power. Cities from New York to Nashville are reporting record low temperatures, overwhelmed shelters, and mounting fatalities. Emergency crews are stretched thin. Vulnerable populations are at risk, and nearly 200 million Americans remain affected by conditions that could persist for days. Taken together, this is the final warning. A nation dealing with unrest at home while navigating escalating dangers abroad cannot afford leadership failures. The thread connecting these crises is not chaos, it is accountability. Democracy does not survive on autopilot. Truth does not defend itself, and stability is not guaranteed. This moment demands awareness, engagement, and unity. Because when pressure builds everywhere at once, the cost of inaction becomes impossible to ignore. And now more than ever, the future depends on what we choose to confront and what we refuse to look away from.